Thank you everybody for the feedback in the last video. So let's continue with Chip Wars, a series that looks at the innovations taking place at the heart of computing devices today. The current heavyweights in ARM-based mobile devices are Samsung, Qualcomm, and Apple, while Intel is gearing up to try and bring the reign with its x86 expertise. But this video is about how NVIDIA's Tegra is advancing.
So what the f is so special about this Tegra 4 I keep hearing about?
At its heart, NVIDIA is the largest dedicated computer graphics company. So when mobile gaming exploded, NVIDIA had to play catch-up to compete. For a while, NVIDIA's strategy was to be the first to market with advanced ARM core designs. The Tegra 2 was the first dual-core Cortex-A9 and the first out-of-order execution processor. The Tegra 3 took it a step further with the first quad-core Cortex-A9. But in the spring of 2012, NVIDIA only had about 3% of the mobile market, compared to Qualcomm's 33%. But now NVIDIA is focusing its aim on tablets, Windows RT devices, and cars.
I would like to see if we could be more successful in phones.
The Tegra 4 is performance optimized as the first quad-core ARM Cortex-A15, maxing out at 1.9 GHz. It also has a power-saving 5th Cortex-A15 running at up to 800 MHz. They save power by dropping the chip fabrication process from 40 nanometers to 28 nanometers to reduce power consumption by 40%. And an upcoming Tegra 4 with a 4G LTE modem built onto the chip should be shipping soon. At the keynote, NVIDIA bragged about 72 GPU cores.
Whoa, what does that mean? I've never heard such a thing in a mobile chip.
Yeah, that was really some clever marketing. Basically, NVIDIA defines a core as a vertex unit that renders 3D graphics or a pixel unit that renders colors. But by this same measure, the PowerVR SGX 554 in Apple's current A6X chip has 128 custom cores. But what's more interesting is the frequency maxing out at 520 MHz, because in graphics technology, performance is more than just the number of cores. So while NVIDIA doesn't say much about relative GPU performance, assuming max frequency, the Tegra 4 should benchmark slightly better than Apple's A6X. NVIDIA really wants to see the Tegra 4 in smartphones.
I would like to see if we could be more successful in phones.
At CES 2013, the CEO spent 15 minutes talking about taking pictures. Often the best way to take pictures is with HDR, high dynamic range. Poorly exposed pictures look like this. Basically, HDR combines multiple pictures taken at different exposures to create the best image with optimal exposure. The problem is that HDR is too slow. It really only works when the subjects are still, and it's usually too slow for real-world performance. Personally, I just turn that thing off all the time. But the Tegra 4 uses the GPU to help speed up the HDR computation, creating what NVIDIA calls always-on HDR for HDR video and one-shot HDR pictures. But as with most tech announcements, the Tegra 4 has its fair share of criticisms. Some people complained about the non-unified architecture of the Tegra 4.
What?
Remember the 72 vertex and pixel cores I mentioned earlier? Well, there are actually more advanced unified shader cores that can render any type of graphics. 3D positions, shapes, and colors. This cleaner architecture is already in Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Plus and Pro processors, but it's not in the Tegra 4. Some developers really wanted to see more broad API support.
API support? What's an API?
APIs are like software languages. Some are proprietary, but the interesting APIs are open standard and royalty-free. The Kronos Group is an industry consortium that creates and promotes adoption of popular graphics APIs, but the Tegra 4 doesn't support OpenCL or OpenGL ES 3.0, a cross-language multi-platform API that programmers can use to render graphics through hardware acceleration to make faster apps by making use of the GPU. And the Tegra 4 doesn't even support NVIDIA's own CUDA parallel computing platform. But hardware and software development is a chicken and egg type problem. It's true that in mobile gaming today, most small developers are shooting for Angry Bird type success, using simple graphics and game mechanics. So maybe broad API support isn't really necessary. At least not yet. But that could be bad news for Tegra 4 devices if the next popular game and benchmarks are optimized on one of these unsupported platforms. Besides, if you're spending over $600 for a flagship tablet or smartphone, wouldn't you expect it to work with any game that might come out for at least 2 or 3 years?
Well, sure. But isn't all this speculation? When will the Tegra 4 actually come out?
Here's the interesting part. The first implementation of the Tegra 4 may come from NVIDIA itself through its handheld gaming device, Project Shield. But in the announcement of Project riot shield, I noticed a heatsink above the processor. A heatsink is designed to cool the processor by dissipating heat into the surrounding air. This tells me that the quad-core Cortex-A15s might need a lot of power and they might run a little hot. And this is a tough thing to deal with in smaller form-factor smartphones. But tablets and notebooks should have more room and bigger batteries, because nobody likes a drained battery. But the underclocked Cortex-A15 in the Tegra 4 is a good compromise for low-performance tasks, hopefully extending battery life.
What I really want to know is which processor will be the best in 2013. I want to start building my Amazon wishlist early this year.
Truth is that no one really has an answer, but it would be good to think about this. At its heart, NVIDIA's specialty is computer graphics, but the tidal wave of mobile devices caught all PC chip vendors by surprise. And since NVIDIA is supposed to be all about graphics, many programmers are waiting for the day when a chip company can unify GPU core architectures across desktops, servers, and handhelds. Software developers want a hardware architecture and open APIs that make it easier and cheaper to create great games that can scale out to as many devices as possible. So there was some disappointment when the graphics processing in the Tegra 4 architecturally appeared to be just like a Tegra 3, but on steroids. Overall, I think the Tegra 4 is a safe step forward.
What do you mean, safe step?
As I said in Chip Wars 10, if the mobile industry is smashing Moore's Law to pieces, continued innovation will get more and more expensive. It costs money to support more APIs. The silicon itself is a big expense in making chips. The smaller the chip, the lower the cost. So chip companies need a huge market to pay for future research and development, and they need to stay focused on things that people do most with their devices.
By introducing new capabilities like photography, I think that we can make much more magical devices.
Oh, that must be why NVIDIA kept talking about pictures at their keynote.
Exactly. The most impressive thing about the Tegra 4 is that it can hold its own against Apple's A6X at roughly half the size, in part due to its smaller fabrication process. So in the end, it seems that NVIDIA is saving its ammunition by doing just enough to stay competitive in the mobile chip industry. And for the first time, finally, NVIDIA can claim to have the best mobile GPU on the market. But we'll know for sure when the Tegra 4 starts showing up in devices, because right now, as I'm recording, the Tegra 4 just started sampling with vendors. So stay subscribed for a final comparison once the results are in.